Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today's national meeting session. My name is Jessica Dockstader, and I'm an analyst in the BWC TTA Outreach Coordinator, working with CNA and BJA's Body-Worn Camera Training and Technical Assistance Program. As a reminder, points of views or opinions herein do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. Thank you. Please reach out to the chat function or email bwctta@cna.org if you have any questions throughout this session or throughout the national meeting. Now I'd like to hand it over to Captain Dan Zender, our BWC TTA lead and subject matter expert, who will be leading the session. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Jessica. Welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate your attending this session on emerging training practices. I hope that you'll find this session informative and that you'll have some takeaways from the session, some nuggets of good ideas that you take back to your agency for consideration and implementation. By way of introduction, again, Dan Zender, I'm a retired captain from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. I served there for 22 years, and one of my assignments from 2014 to mid-2016 was as the body camera program manager for the department in its initial deployment. I've been working with the TTA since 2015 as a subject matter expert, and I've been part of my background prior to getting into body cameras was as the Academy Sergeant for the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. So with that introduction, I know that most of you out there are in the initial deployment phase, or maybe newly deployed, or maybe even adding cameras to your current programs. Frequently, what I've seen and what other members of the TTA have seen with agencies that are in the initial deployment first round of body cameras is that they do a pretty good job of constructing initial training for their agencies and the deployment of the cameras, but that's about where it stops. So I'm here today to hopefully get you thinking about integrating body cameras into a much larger agency-wide training program, if you will. So while I am going to talk about initial training, I'm going to talk about some emerging practices that myself and other members of the TTA have seen from progressive agencies, and as well as adding some of my thoughts about unique ways to train body cameras. Now, I could literally go and talk about this for hours and hours, but we only have 45 minutes in this presentation. So this is going to be more conceptual in its presentation rather than down in the weeds. But that doesn't prohibit you from certainly from asking. I'm hoping to have plenty of time at the end of this session for questions. But please don't wait. If you have a question that comes up, submit it, and we'll get to them at the end of the session. Again, I'm trying to give this a large scale or high overview of training, but I can get down into some very detailed specifics if it comes up in the questions. And during this session, I'm going to be asking you survey questions. So please, when the poll sets up or shows up on the screen, please submit your answer quickly. And then at some point during that next section that I'm talking about, I'll present the results. So here's your first survey question. Go ahead, Jessica, if you would. So how long is your current or planned initial deployment training? First slide, please. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about initial deployment training. I want to start off with something that over time we've seen an increase since the initial years of the grant process of more and more of the vendors providing training packages to the agencies. And that's great and wonderful. They are experts at hardware and software, and that's about it. Please do not abdicate your training program or responsibility to the vendors and leave it at that. So as you'll see, our poll results just came up. We have 42% less than 4 hours. Looks like the majority of people are at 4 to 8 hours. And then just a handful, a couple of agencies at 8 to 12 hours. The biggest takeaway that we've seen in this initial training is that agencies have to very, very carefully think this out and plan it out long in advance from your even at the as soon as you decide on your RFP who your vendor is going to be, you need to get engaged with that. How you do it requires, again, some planning, and smaller agencies will obviously have an easier time conducting this initial training. Mid and large size agencies must consider how it's going to be done. Are you going to do this centralized inside the agency? If you have an agency of 250 officers or greater, maybe that's a challenge. Or are you going to decentralize it? Our experience in Las Vegas is my sergeant and 2 officers trained the initial deployment of 750 cameras. We kept it centralized to ensure consistency of training and messaging. Now, that may not be appropriate for every agency, so certainly a centralized is more resource intensive, requires more people to be involved perhaps, and a lot of time for those trainers, but you have that uniform message. The disadvantage that you go decentralized, and you sometimes can lose control of the quality of training depending on the size of your organization. So questions should be, how long is that training? And the answer to that is it's not a one-size-fits-all answer. It depends on the content. And so we saw in the poll results, some of you are saying less than 4 hours. And so you have to ask yourself, is that long enough to get all the information that's kind of a best practices? Is that enough time? In 2018, CNA published the BWC training guide for kind of an initial deployment training guide. I'm going to give you links to that and show you that at the end of the session. And this was best practice recommendation. And in summary, this recommendation was a 4-module system. And I think when I get done explaining these modules, you're going to look at that and go, can I get that done in 4 hours? For all but the smallest agencies, that's going to be a challenge, especially when I talk about some of the other things that we certainly recommend that you do in this initial phase of training. So module 1 in the recommendation is kind of an introduction and background on body cameras. So let officers in your agency understand what the role of body cameras are in policing, kind of giving them a history of both national and local key events that may have moved the agency towards the deployment of body cameras. I think it's important also that officers understand the agency's goals for deploying cameras. Are we there to protect our officers? Are we there to gather evidence? Is it community demand? And part of that is acknowledging the concerns of officers that may not be used to this technology. Certainly, if you're an agency that has in-car video or has maybe had limited deployment of body cameras, there'll be a little more comfort. I know in Las Vegas, there was a lot of discomfort back in 2014 to this idea of body cameras in the pre-Ferguson days. Part of this module is to talk a little bit about the research on body cameras, and you've gotten some of that in earlier sessions, and it kind of makes sure the officers understand the terminology that may be unique to body cameras that they may not be familiar with. The second module of this training is kind of the device-specific use and operations, and this is where that vendor piece can help. If your vendor's going to come in and maybe send people to your agency, they can be very good at teaching the officers the operation of the camera, how to upload the information, how to use the content management system, and that sort of thing. So, that obviously, I know we're concerned about that, officers knowing how to use the equipment, but it's simply one slice of the pie. The third module is perhaps the most important one, and that's your body camera practice policy and practices. You know, and there's some things that the guide recommends that you talk to your officers about in pretty much excruciating detail. You know, what are your state laws regarding body cameras? You know, early in the deployment of body cameras on a national level, there wasn't a lot of state guidance, and Mike White in one of the earlier sessions mentioned that there's a lot of guidance now coming from states around the country about what will be in your policy and what the state mandates in certain areas. They should understand who is an authorized user of the camera system. You know, the pre and post shift inspections, what an officer's responsibility is in preparing for shift, and his responsibility of the equipment, notifying supervisors when it works or doesn't work, kind of a pre-operational check. And of course, the big area to cover is when to activate. Your officers have to really clearly understand what your agency's position and policy is on the activation of the camera. Citizen notification of activation. Now, one of the just the previous session, one of the previous sessions has had a long discussion on do your officers notify or do they not notify a citizen that are being recorded. Needs to be clear to the officer when that's appropriate, when it may not be appropriate, if it's mandated, if it's state law, etc. When to deactivate, and which is, you know, short of not activating your camera, deactivating your camera once it's on is the other thing that can really have implications for the agency if your officers don't understand the policy. Any discretion that the officers have on activation or deactivation, they need to know those things very, very closely or very clearly. And then when recording is restricted or prohibited, you know, the locker rooms, the supervisory meetings, those sorts of things, community events, you know, those things that the officer doesn't have that camera on, they should be very well aware of that. A big area is their Fourth Amendment responsibilities. When can they turn that camera on in accordance to the Fourth Amendment, general Fourth Amendment laws, and any application it may have within your state. Officer reviewing a video, both in normal situations and in those critical incidents. A key one that many agencies struggle with if they don't have auto integration of CAD with their content management system is officer labeling or categorizing, tagging, whatever you call it. Your policy should be very specific, and they should be trained on just exactly what's to go in the administrative data of those videos and why that's important. That tagging is directly related to the retention of that video for evidentiary or non-evidentiary purposes. It's also directly related to if that's not done properly and the retention periods are incorrect, it's also a direct relation. It has a direct impact on your storage of that video over time. They should be trained on data transfer policy, on downloads and report writing, what your agency's policy is on that. And they should be aware, as I said earlier, on the storage retention link. And finally, one of the recommendations in that module is to talk to them about release of video. You know, officers should be clearly aware of their ability or inability to release that video in the field. Not a good practice to do so in the field because you create a public record at that point, which may or may not be able to be tracked by the agency. So they need to understand that there are prohibitions on doing that, but also the ability to advise citizens on how to file a public records request. And the final module of the initial training is directed towards supervisory access to video. You know, when can a supervisor access video? Making it clear to all officers in attendance that it's not going to be used, while it will be used for compliance checks, it won't be used for and compliance checks and for performance evaluation. It's not going to be used in the fishing expeditions that many officers are concerned about. And this This module also covers body camera video review subsequent to critical incidents, most commonly officer-involved shootings, but it could be any other type of critical incident, and what a supervisor's responsibilities are to day-to-day operations of monitoring the body camera implementation used by officers under their command. And finally, the last piece of Module 4 is what's the agency's responsibility in managing the program. Officers should understand that the agency will be looking at video for different reasons, and those reasons should be made clear to the officers at that time. Now, once you've completed that, and I know that sounds like a lot of information, that's why we certainly recommend that anything less than 4 hours is really, really pushing it, unless you're the smallest of agencies. You should seriously consider both knowledge-based and competency-based testing of the information that you're given in this initial training. So, you know, a simple test, 10 or 12 or 15 questions based on the material, and then a competency test. And I know for larger agencies, I should cringe thinking of, well, you know, we've got 1,200 officers in our agency. How am I possibly going to do it? It can be done. It takes some planning, but the officer needs to show competency in activating or deactivating the camera, uploading it, and putting basic information into the content management system. This is all important because it goes to proving subsequent to their training that the agency did train their officers to a standard. Prior to being the program manager, I was the academy sergeant, and not a month went by where I didn't get 2 or 3 requests for, or not requests, subpoenas for training records of officers involved in either lawsuits or some sort of legal action against the agencies. And I was subpoenaed on training records, not just the fact that the officer received the training, but they wanted to see the lesson plans. They wanted to see the test materials. Agency can show due diligence if they can produce all these records, the lesson plans, certainly these knowledge-based and competency-based tests. And so I would encourage you to consider that. If you want to contact me separately after the meeting, I can give you some hints on how to do that. Most importantly, after doing all this, you obviously will keep training attendance records and any of this testing material. Retain all these training records for the retention periods of your your agency under state law. So the next area I want to talk about is academy training. For those of you that have academies, and I didn't set up a poll question for this, but I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk through this. If you do have academy training, your goal should be to integrate body cameras into all aspects of the curriculum. You can make a choice of deploying those cameras to new officers as they start the academy. Some agencies I know in Las Vegas, we were very concerned about giving them that piece of equipment during academy training. So we reached out to our manufacturer who gave us inoperable body cameras that we used. And we integrated it into all aspects of our curriculum, and mostly with the activation and deactivation, the fact of wearing it, positioning it on their body, and getting that muscle memory going. And doing that early on in all the scenario training that you may have in your academy will certainly pay dividends. And any scenario that you do have that is testing some other skill set, integrate body cameras into that test. Grade the officer's decision-making on activation, deactivation, Fourth Amendment decision-making, talking to victims and witnesses that may be in the scenarios. Consider using that footage to reinforce training. When you have scenarios, role plays, maybe tests that are role play based, they should all be recorded, and then have reviews of that footage as part of the test result evaluation. Retain all that training footage in the same retention periods of all your other academy training records. Consider setting up a separate folder or section in your content management system for training of academy training and dump those videos in there, link them by the officer's identification or however you would manage their regular training records. If your recruits attend a regional or multi-agency academy, make sure that if they have body camera as part of that curriculum, maybe they have a small section on state laws, for example, regarding body cameras. Certainly make sure it meets your agency's requirements, and then consider instituting a module of training back at the agency before the officer begins field training, which is the next section I'm going to go into. And so I have a second poll question. Go ahead and post that second poll question, and if you would, hold the results till I call for them. Next poll question, there we go. Body cameras are used in our field training and evaluation program to document performance and support evaluations. So in your field training and evaluation program, or FTEP, body cameras can be a vital tool for the program. Both the FTO and the officer, the new officer, should be wearing cameras. Footage can be used to document performance and support evaluation, but doing so requires a little bit of work on the agency's part. You have to be able to link the video to your field training documentation, especially when it may be used for purposes such as, for other purposes besides evidence. You may have a piece of training video from the field with a FTO, with a new officer that a training officer is using to document performance, but it's also a piece of evidence. So now you have its primary use. It was obviously the evidentiary use of it, but a copy of that should be brought over into perhaps an FTEP file for that particular officer, and that that video is linked to those field training records. The other thing, and this may sound pretty basic, but field training officers need to be trained on how to use the video as a training tool. Time for video review has to be built into the shift, and I know in some cases that can be tough to do. Maybe not every call is evaluated, but at some point the training officer and the new trainee need to look at that video. So either at the end of the call or at the end of the shift, time has to be built in for the officers to look at that. The reason this is that using video is a great idea is it helps FTOs show the new officers that event from a different perspective. You know, they get tunnel vision. We all, you know, for the police officers out there, we've all been through field training, and your world exists, that little piece of real estate right in front of you, and you swear to God after the call when your FTO says, "Didn't you see this and didn't you see that?" You didn't see it, right? Having the FTO show the training officer his video camera perspective can be very enlightening to the officer. Key policy points such as activation, deactivation, notification, Fourth Amendment, that sort of thing, those need to be monitored very, very closely with the new officer and by the FTO and reinforced with the new officer. And these key policy points, you should consider adding them into your field training evaluation documents that you use. So anything that's critical, the agency determines is a risk or critical to the agency, and body cameras can play a role in documenting the new officer's performance, add that onto your documentation. So can we see the survey results, please? So 47% of you use body cameras, 34% do not, and 19% say that you don't have a training program. So for those of you that don't, I would ask that you consider looking at it to see if you quite possibly might look at implementing that in the future. So the next area, next poll question. Next survey question, please. Which of the below most closely describe your annual body camera refresher training? 1 to 4 hours annual, 1 to 4 hours online, 4 to 8 hours in training in any format, some other format, or we have not yet developed any refresher training program. And hold the results for that as I go into annual refresher training. So it's absolutely critical to ensure that all officers are up to date in the latest body camera tactics or topics. You know, legal issues, policy updates, equipment upgrades, trends, success stories for the agency, areas of improvement. It's important that officers get that. Again, smaller agency, it's easier to do that than with larger agencies. How you conduct this, though, this annual refresher training, is certainly dependent on the size of your agency and your resources available. Larger agencies may have an online training platform, and that's great. You may decide to do this refresher training centralized in a classroom where you bring all the officers into a classroom, or you may do decentralized by precinct or area. You may even decide to do it supervisor-led. As you start to go down to that level, though, as with that initial training, sometimes you can lose consistency of messaging and standardization and emphasis on those things that you feel are important to your agency. And finally, you might consider an agency training team that goes around and does annual training. It could be any mix of that. The key here is that annual refresher training is critical to keep and ensure that your officers are up to date. Again, consider, unlike initial training, the competency base isn't really necessary unless perhaps you're getting a radical new piece of equipment, but consider short knowledge-based tests for this annual refresher training. Certainly if you have an online system, that's easier to do. Again, as with all other training documentation, keep this at agency level. Can we see the poll results, please? So 1 to 24% have 1 to 4 hours. 4% of you have online training. The rest of you have some other format or some sort of training, but I've seen, you know, at least a couple of hours, an hour, a couple hours of training for annual refresher. So that's 69% of those. 69% of you have not yet developed refresher training. So hopefully this gives you some things to think about when it comes to that refresher training. The next piece of training is supervisory or promotional training. You know, unfortunately, kind of some of the lessons we've learned around the country of regarding incidents that end up negatively for police agencies demonstrate that supervisory failures regarding the operations and oversights of cameras are generally play some part in the negative consequences for the agency. Agencies have a responsibility to ensure that supervisors are properly trained on their roles for body camera management. So let's pull up the fourth survey question, please. So as you're answering that, you know, agencies have a responsibility to ensure that their supervisory personnel are properly trained in their roles with body camera management. They need to understand their responsibilities from a policy standpoint, their responsibility for overseeing officer compliance. I like to tell people, and I say this very frequently, that body cameras are just like any other tool a first-line supervisor would use to monitor an officer's performance. And so it's a performance management tool for that first-line supervisor. How the agency allows them to use that is up to the agency, but those supervisors, when they're either newly promoted or in your initial training to supervise, should understand what their responsibilities are and what their constraints may be. They should understand, supervisors should understand the use of body cameras in routine and non-routine operations, tactical operations. Do you have, for example, you know, do you allow body cameras in your incident command post? What responsibilities would a supervisor have in a hostage barricade situation to dictate operation of cameras or deactivation of cameras? Any of those sorts of things that you may have in your agency, those supervisors should be trained on that. Certainly any type of critical incident, use of force, officer involved shootings, all of their responsibilities should be trained to them in some sort of supervisory module. If you don't address the supervisor responsibility, it can come back with negative consequences for the agency. It should be made clear to supervisors that compliance and performance verification is one thing, and fishing expeditions for bad behavior are completely different. Supervisors it must be made crystal clear to them what their level of responsibility and accountability is to the agency for doing those jobs, and their tasks should be audited, and checks should be put in place to minimize the chance of any supervisor using video negatively that has negative consequences, both for the officers that work for the supervisor and for the agency. And this training should continue for each level of supervision. We very frequently think of first line supervisors, and then you get promoted to sergeant, we give you body camera training. But then somebody, if you have gets promoted to lieutenant, and all of a sudden now they're watch commanders, or they're in charge of major incidents and maybe civil unrest situations, and they receive no training whatsoever. So consider training, albeit shorter, obviously, than the first line supervisor training, for your lieutenants, captains, majors, and so on. Each one of these levels has some sort of commensurate responsibility to the body camera program within the agency. And again, failure to do so could have negative consequences for the agency. Can we see the survey results, please? So 51%, I can't read everything here, 51% do it during the initial deployment. It looks like very few of you do it subsequent to promotion. Most of it, the rest of it is informal or on the job training. Again, it would not hurt, as with the rest of these, everything else, that this training is certainly documented. Any formal supervisory training is documented and placed in training records for that particular supervisor. The next area I'd like to talk about is roll call training. So we have another survey question. Our agency discusses body camera topics at roll call training more than once a week, less than once a week, as scheduled by the agency or at supervisor's discretion. When it comes to roll call training, the first decision the agency obviously has to make is this going to be formal or informal? If you have formal periodic body camera roll call training, that requires agency direction and control. So this is training that bridges the gap between that initial training or academy training and field trip training, and then the annual refresher training. So in between all that, you get your initial training as your new officer on the agency. But before you get annual or refresher training, things come up. Best practices, maybe something that the agency wants to reinforce that they're seeing agency-wise, might be a policy area that needs improvement. Formal process kind of bridges that gap, and it ensures topical relevancy based on national or local lessons learned. Formal roll call training ensures uniform topical message and documentation. So formal training is put together by the agency and sent out to the agency to be implemented. Could be at the supervisory level, could be an agency trainer. However, formal training is not meant to stifle informal or supervisory roll call discussions. Now, if you do informal roll call training, it's only as good as the supervisor providing it. The danger here is that some well-intending supervisor puts out incorrect information, and then that's acted on by the officer and could have negative consequences for the agency. This shouldn't stop informal body camera training, but it needs to be closely monitored. One of the things, and I think Tom Woodmansee mentioned it in one of the other sessions, is the use of agency video to reinforce roll call training. This can be a great training multiplier, if you will, but it's certainly recommended if you're going to do this, the officer involved in recording that video is consulted and maybe even gives his approval, depending on your organizational climate to use that video as a training tool. Of course, you don't have a problem if you use external video external to the agency, which I know a lot of agencies like to do. The key is that you have a program that's in place. Again, it's documented. The agency can go back and say, 5 times a year we do roll call training, or once a month agency units around the agency do roll call training. Can we see the survey results, please? Okay, so it looks like the majority of you do it either once a week, less than once a week, or as scheduled by the agency. Or the vast majority of you, 62%, at the supervisor's discretion. Question I'd ask for everybody out there when it comes to roll call training is that training being documented by the agency? Doesn't have to be fancy, but it should be documented. So if we can have the next slide, please. So I want to talk for a few minutes about training use. Next survey question. So I want to talk about these, each of these 4 bullets you see on your screen. I'm going to talk about them briefly. So do you train body cameras at the range? I think it's very important that supervisors and officers and agency leaders understand what the perspective of the camera is when the officer fires any of the agency's weapon systems. So if you direct where that camera is placed on the officer, the agency should be aware of all the weapon system the agency uses and where the vantage, the view, the range of view of the camera is, and if it's impeded whatsoever by that placement. If you do pre-purchase testing of a video system, I would highly recommend that part of that testing of those body cameras is you take them up to the range and you fire your weapon systems based on, and to see what the perspective of that camera is. I think it'll yield some interesting results. We did that in Las Vegas, and some of the initial locations where the agency had decided they kind of wanted to allow law officers some discretion, just were not prudent when you looked at the different types of weapon systems, everything from rifles to shotguns to handguns. And then, having an officer actually go to the range and qualify and then review his footage, his or her footage during that, after that qualification, certainly is interesting. It gives the officer perspective and lets them know what their camera's copying. Ideally, you'd like to do that initial fielding training, but I realize that may not be practical for the vast majority of agencies out there. But as soon as those cameras are deployed, if you can get them to the range when they qualify, use those and record that training session, it does provide interesting perspectives. And if possible, in the future of range qualifications, consider integrating it into every qualification. Different qualification courses, for example, shooting on the move, can yield very different visual perspectives and results for the officer. May I see the survey results, please? So 64% of you do use it during range qualification. In our next section, we're going to talk about defensive tactics. So it looks like everybody out there is involved in it. Not everybody, but those of you that answered the question, it's some sort of mix of using this in your training, which is all good to see. And for those of you that aren't that far yet, hopefully this will give you some things to think about. So defensive tactics. Consider integrating defensive body cameras into your defensive tactics training. Now, I know many of us, at least we did in Las Vegas, a lot of times you're not doing defensive tactics in uniform and full gear. But I think it's necessary, certainly during your selection of the camera, when you're deciding what vendor you're going to purchase, that you do have your defensive tactics instructors play with these body cameras and see, what they're like and how they could affect your defensive tactics that you train to your officers. As with firearms training, if you use them, and I'm not advocating or even recommending that it's on every defensive tactics session, But the officers should do several sessions a year where they get to see the different techniques that are authorized by your agency and the implications of them using their body cameras. You know, what it captures, what it doesn't capture, especially when you're involved in defensive tactics role playing. And it will allow the officers to see what the limitations of the footage are, so they can't rely on, well, I'm going to use this technique and I know my body camera is going to capture it. Not necessarily, and many times it doesn't capture the actual application of the technique always as clearly as we'd like to. And it lets backing officers or supporting officers see what that result, what that video capture view is. So a word of caution here. Doing this isn't designed to caution the officers about what the camera might capture and how it will look after an event. It's here to reinforce that the idea with those officers that may not provide all the necessary visual support for the use of force and activity that the officers and or police administrators may believe it will. And by doing this, you may also realize that some of your tactics you may desire to modify them a little bit. Moving on to EVOC. Using body cameras during EVOC training can certainly be beneficial, especially if the agency doesn't have in-car systems. One of the main training objectives is to get officers to activate their body cameras as soon as it is safe and practical after the initiation of a pursuit. A muscle memory thing. And doing that in EVOC, if you don't have auto activation equipment in your car, in other words, turning the lights and sirens activates the camera, this is critically important so that at the end of that pursuit, the officer's not jumping out of the car and the body camera isn't on. So it's that muscle memory again. It also, where the camera is mounted on the officer, can provide some interesting perspectives. If you've watched any of the live TV shows that now are on, well, used to be on TV, but have the body camera perspective in it, nothing like watching one of your officers doing a pursuit at 90 miles an hour, one hand on the steering wheel, the other hand on the big gulp. These are things that when we see, we want to take action on right away. A lot of information can be seen from inside the vehicle from the officer's body camera perspective that you don't get on the in-car systems. And so, and these are things that officers may not be aware that they're doing. And if you have in-car and body camera video, you can now begin to look at the decisions that your officers are making during these high-speed pursuits, which are high liability incidents for the agency, and tailor maybe training or adjust policy accordingly from what you see on that. Finally, tactical and specialized training. What I'm talking about here is any type of advanced or specialized training that the agency engages in. Obviously, what this encompasses will differ from agency to agency. The concept is to bring body cameras into that training to help officers understand the advantages and limitations of body cameras in particular situations, reinforce your training objectives, provide training evaluation, assess and revise tactics, procedures, and techniques, and provide agency leaders with powerful tools for making operational decisions. Depending on what this training looks like in your agency, you could integrate body cameras into crisis intervention training, which of course is a hot topic right now. Critical incident training, such as active shooter, civil unrest, specific training to hostage barricade situations, tactical command posts, that sort of thing. Any type of supervisory advanced individual training. Again, the idea here is that you use body cameras as a tool to enhance the training and provide valuable feedback to officers and training staff and your police administrators. I'm going to ask one last question, and then I'm going to open it up there. If we go ahead and post that last survey question, please. Agency level training is managed by your training section, a training officer, by each individual precinct, or none of the above. Next slide, please. And when you get those results, you can go ahead and post them. So we put this, I put this slide in case we had time to talk about it. I'm just going to briefly mention these things before I open it up to questions. But everything I've discussed in this session requires that the agency develop processes to embed body cameras in the overall agency training program. So any piecemeal approach In other words, Academy handles their own training, FTEP handles theirs, you know, the precincts handle theirs. It's kind of problematic. There's no unifying force there. So, and it's hence the question. So your training section, 52% of you is managed. All this stuff is managed by the training section or a training officer, probably for smaller agencies. And I'm assuming you have one agency, it's at the precinct level. I suspect that might be a larger agency. And then none of the above are probably folks that haven't gotten there yet. The key is, if you embed body cameras in all the areas that I talked about, the agency, at the agency level, some office or some person needs to be responsible for ensuring consistency and documentation and retention of that documentation. And certainly the scheduling and all those things that we know go into training management. If you do any sort of decentralized training, kind of a train the trainer for the large organizations, that training should come from that training section in conjunction maybe with your body camera team. Next slide, please. So I talked at the beginning about resources. The document you see on the slide, you can just write that title down if you want, or you can look back later at this. You can go to the TTA website and find this document. This is the initial training resource guide. Next slide, please. And the other document I encourage you to look at is, this is the training spotlight. This talks about many of the other things that I talk about and some of the research behind it. Very valuable guide. So any of you trainers, those of you out there, either at the administration level or down the training management level, two important documents that I would encourage you to look at. So with that, I will open it up for questions.
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions here. So the first one is, when using video for training purposes, what privacy precautions need to be made in regards to those persons in the video?
So two levels to that. Since it's not going out for public, this is not public release. This is so you don't have a public records type of thing. Certainly the agency can make a call for anything that's sensitive. In other words, those things that I guess I call it the common sense filter, right? If you have a subject that's undressed, obviously we would want to do some sort of retention of that. Would I redact if an officer or somebody from the public used a four-letter word? No, I wouldn't waste my time with that. But common sense kind of dictates that. But when you release this video for training, it should be very tightly controlled because, again, if it leaves your system, in other words, you download it from your content management system and you put it on a disk, you've lost control of that video and it could end up anywhere. If it is viewed from inside your evidence management or content management system, you can control access and that could be audited. So if you use it, be very, very, very careful of taking anything out of that network to distribute for training. But common sense would kind of dictate that type of redaction. Again, we're talking about, you're talking to your commissioned employees or maybe dispatch, anybody that works for the department, it's not going out to the public, so you don't have that public records concern.
Okay, and the other question we have here is, are there any written training policies that anyone would be able to share?
So that's a good question. As the agents that I've seen that have talked about this, they talk about it in their general body camera policy. So they'll say, okay, so the Office of Body Camera Management is responsible for body camera management, and the training office is responsible for training, and that's kind of where it stops. I have not seen an agency that has a specific, because we don't look at training policies, we look at the body camera policies. So if any of you out there that are in this session that do have it, for the individual that asked that question, I would post that on the on the messages and see any of you out there, contact this individual. And if you've got something that you use, please share it. Whoever asked the question, if you'll email me after the session or contact me on the message board, I'll put it out to the TTA member, SMEs, and see if anybody's aware of one.
Okay, and that's all the questions that we had in the chat.
In closing, we got a couple of minutes. I want to again reinforce that body camera training, I think if you look at some of the national incidents over the past 3 or 4 years, where we've kind of scratched our head and said, how could that happen? At some point, I would guess if we did a detailed autopsy of that particular event, we'd find a contributing factor would be a training failure at some point. And so in summarizing this session, it is important that body cameras are more than just that initial training that we drop it. They're a very, very powerful tool and can provide a vast amount of information and assistance to the agency and to officers about how to improve their performance, improve policy, improve operations. But you're not going to get that unless you integrate it into that, all these training areas that I've talked about. It's seamless, it's integrated, and somebody's looking at the results of all that training. And if you do that, again, for those of you out there in smaller agencies, it may sound like a lot of work, but for you, it's actually easier than the Philadelphias and the Chicagos of the world, right? You could do this a lot more efficiently than bigger agencies. But it's certainly, with enough planning, regardless of the size of your agency, it can be done at some level within the agency. And it becomes a key contributor to those risk management issues for an agency. It doesn't do you any good to have a tool that collects information that shows officers, an officer failure, a policy failure, or supervisory failure, for example, or training failure. And we've got dozens and dozens and dozens of videos of that in our agency, and nobody's looking. And when they find it, nobody's doing anything. We have that ability now to use this video and use it to make sure our agencies are protected, our officers are protected, and that we improve the shortcomings that we have, and we reinforce those good things that our officers are doing. And with that, I thank you for your time. Again, if anybody has any questions, you can email me at the address on the screen. You can reach out to me on the platform before the session's done. And I would be more than happy to answer your questions. Thank you.